dire warnings of the dangers of COVID vaccines from self-described experts and celebrities. Americans are inundated with vaccine disinformation from social media to some of the most highly watched cable TV show hosts like Tucker Carlson.
So maybe it doesn't work and they're simply not telling you that. Well, you hate to think that, especially if you've gotten 2 shots. But what's the other potential explanation?
It's not just that audiences are being duped by blatant lies. The people peddling this disinformation repeatedly raise alarms about the dangers of vaccines by preying on legitimate fears of government overreach and untrustworthy corporations. Researchers have connected disinformation with the high rate of vaccine hesitancy in the United States, which is second only to Russia among wealthy countries, according to The Economist. Vaccines have proved remarkably effective against the worst effects of COVID-19, yet only 53% of Americans are fully vaccinated, a number that now lags behind dozens of countries that are beginning to turn the corner on the pandemic, even though the US was among one of the first countries to make the vaccines widely available. A testament to the power of disinformation, vaccine hesitancy has had fatal consequences that deniers consistently ignore. By July, 99% of new COVID-related deaths were among the unvaccinated. According to a report by the Center for Countering Digital Hate, just 12 people are responsible for the majority of COVID disinformation spread on social media. None are infectious disease experts, but many have enriched themselves by spreading disinformation. Our next guest is part of a team that has exposed how COVID disinformation has been amplified by the same networks of influencers, think tanks, and nonprofits that were created by the fossil fuel industry to build opposition to climate science. Just like with vaccine disinformation, climate disinformation was created and spread by forces seeking to profit by preying on the fears of those who distrust government overreach and regulation. Now joining us to discuss this is Sharon Kelly, an attorney and freelance reporter from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, often reports on energy and climate for the news site DeSmog.com, as well as the New York Times, Guardian, and Nation, and more. Thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So the world is facing 2 grave simultaneous threats. New, deadlier COVID-19 variants are sweeping the globe, adding to the staggering death toll that surpassed 6 million worldwide. Meanwhile, climate scientists are warning that increasing extreme weather, just like Hurricane Ida, which caused devastating flooding, and the forest fires that are sweeping the West will continue to batter the Earth unless humans take action. Now, even though there's a near scientific consensus on how best to deal with these threats, humanity continues to hurtle towards an apocalyptic future, and one of the major driving forces taking us there is disinformation. The agenda of those spreading disinformation is money and power, but also runs deeper. So you spent some time digging into these questions. Let's start with, why do organizations that get funding from fossil fuel companies and also push climate denial also advance vaccine disinformation? What does this tell us about how these 2 issues are linked?
It's a really good question, and I'm afraid there's not a single straightforward answer, right? In terms of what motivates a very wide array of organizations and speakers, right? But I do think we can actually learn a good deal by looking back at sort of the history of what's happened in terms of the way that there has been a debate created over climate science, and the organizations that participated in that, and recognizing too that this infrastructure that was created around climate change, it appears to have also become engaged and involved on questions of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic.
You've reported on how some of the most prominent orgs that push climate denial have also denied COVID-19 and have pushed disinformation related to vaccines and lockdowns. Let's start with the Heartland Institute. Here's a recent clip they broadcast on their YouTube channel about the FDA's approval of the Pfizer vaccine.
The vaccine, despite the enormous number of adverse event reports that have been received by the FDA, has been given a political push to approve it without really adequate evidence of its long-term safety.
So Heartland interviewed a right-wing lawyer who invented false claims of enormous adverse effects due to the vaccine. There's actually fewer real-world side effects than were reported in clinical trials, which showed it to be 91% effective in combating COVID-19. Can you break this down and tell us, talk about who Heartland is, who funds them, and they have a long history in climate science denial.
Right. And so once again, these are, I wish there was a very straightforward answer, but I will do my best. So one of the things to know about the Heartland Institute is that they came to fame really in the 90s, and 80s and 90s for their efforts to convince people that secondhand smoke from cigarettes wasn't dangerous. These were Philip Morris funded efforts. And they've also opposed action on climate change for decades. We do know that for many years they did accept funding from Exxon. They no longer disclose their funding, so information on that has become a little bit more difficult to access publicly. One of the things that we do know is that a significant amount of their funding comes through an organization called Donors Trust. You might have heard of Donors Trust as an example of what researchers call like a dark money organization. So it's basically, these are tactics and layers of paperwork essentially that funders will use to obscure where to obscure their gifts to a particular organization that's involved in advocacy on policy.
And so you've taken a close look at how these organizations operate and just how they are able to spread disinformation and do it so effectively. Talk about what some of their strategies are and sort of the tactics they embrace and how they're able to amplify this information and get it to the American people in this unfiltered way.
Sure. I mean, so I think, again, going back historically, if you look at the way that the debate over climate change was presented in the mainstream media for example, like in the 1990s, right? And this has been, very widely reported. There was the creation of this narrative that that there was a real scientific debate about whether climate change was happening, whether it was caused by people, et cetera. I think at this point the science has become incredibly clear. People are feeling the impacts of climate change in their everyday lives now. And yet there was a network of think tanks and advocacy groups that had worked for decades to present this, to create the impression that there was more scientific uncertainty than actually exists about climate change and about people's role in changing the climate, and specifically fossil fuel's role in changing the climate. I think when it comes to the Heartland Institute and other climate deniers, one of the things that you saw, and we do have access to documents from inside the GCC, I believe it's the Global Climate Coalition. And one of the things that those documents talk about is they include a review of some of the scientific research by climate deniers. And one of the executives with the GCC presents to the other members his conclusion that basically those objections about climate science were not credible. And yet, that same scientist, whose conclusions were viewed as not credible, continued to receive funding from some of the companies that were participated in that coalition, right? And so the reason I'm telling you that story is because one of the things that you learn from that, right, is that these organizations' effectiveness isn't measured by their accuracy. and the like the quality of the work that they're producing. It's measured by the political power and sway that they're able to exercise. Does that make sense?
And yeah, and as you mentioned, the evidence of climate change and the impact it's having on weather is becoming virtually undisputed outside of these same circles. So you pose a question here. Should these two issues should this really be convincing for folks? Should we be listening to the same people that denied the dangers of cigarette smoke and secondhand smoke when we're talking about infectious diseases like COVID, where 99% of recent deaths are among the unvaccinated? There's clearly something to take away from this.
I think like one of the ways that you can assess credibility, right? It relates to the quality of the work that somebody has produced previously, right? And so if you're looking at looking back at like some of the statements that organizations like that have also have a history of doing or who are currently engaged in communications on vaccines. If you look back at what they said about secondhand smoke, did it turn out to be accurate, right? And very clearly the answer there is no. If you look back at some of the models that on climate that were being challenged, in the 70s, that were produced in the 70s, 80s, and were challenged, very strenuously by these sorts of organizations in the 1990s and 2000s. There's been peer-reviewed research looking back at some of those models and showing that actually they were remarkably on point, right? Just because you're wrong on one thing doesn't mean you're wrong on everything necessarily. But I do think it's part of how you assess credibility and part of trying to understand whether you believe what somebody is saying.
Absolutely, and it's not too late on either of these issues. It's not too late for people to turn course and embrace science and embrace evidence, despite all the disinformation out there. And there are signs that increasing number of people are becoming vaccinated, which is the U.S. still lags behind dozens of other countries, but there is still an increasing sign, which is good news for this country. And I just wanted to end on the thought that the United States has an we're destroying millions of vaccine doses because people aren't getting them, while the continent of Africa has 2% of its population vaccinated. So just while wealthy countries are hoarding vaccines, and we also know that the worst effects of climate change are going to be among frontline communities. So ultimately, the cost and the burden is not going to be handled equally at all either. Sharon Kelly, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us at the Real News Network.